In the summer of 1943, German fighter pilots had a nickname for the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They didn't call it a killer, they didn't call it dangerous, they called it a joke, a flying bathtub, a lead sled, an American mistake that wandered into European skies wearing a star and bar. To the men of the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt looked like everything a fighter should not be. It was enormous, over 15,000 pounds empty, nearly 7 tons of aluminum and steel. Its fuselage was thick and bloated, its wings broad and heavy. Next to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the razor-edge Focke-Wulf 190, the P-47 looked clumsy, almost prehistoric. German pilots joked that if you missed it, you weren't trying. They were not wrong about the numbers. A Bf-109 could out-turn a Thunderbolt every time. A FW-190 could climb faster, roll quicker, and dictate the fight. At 15,000 feet, a German fighter could complete a full 360-degree turn in roughly 22 seconds. A P-47 needed nearly 29. In air combat, those 7 seconds were an eternity. 7 seconds meant a firing solution. 7 seconds meant death. American pilots knew this. German pilots knew it better. By early 1943, the US 8th Air Force was paying for it in blood. The Thunderbolt had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, not a knife-fight brawler. Its heart was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. But that power came at a cost. The engine, turbo supercharger, and armored cockpit made the aircraft heavy, and weight was unforgiving in a turning fight. When the P-47 entered combat over Europe in April 1943, its mission was clear. Escort American bombers deep into enemy territory, protect the B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators as they attacked German industry in daylight. It failed. At first, Thunderbolt struggled to stay with the bombers during combat. When German fighters attacked, they didn't engage the escorts directly. They broke away, climbed, dove, and turned vertically, knowing the heavy American fighters couldn't follow. Luftwaffe veterans exploited the Thunderbolt's weaknesses with clinical precision. On June 26, 1943, over northern France, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26, one of Germany's elite fighter units, met P-47s head-on. The result was devastating. 5 Thunderbolts were shot down in minutes. 4 American pilots were killed. The Germans barely broke formation. One of the survivors that day was Captain Robert S. Johnson. Johnson's P-47 was hit again and again. More than 200 cannon and machine gun strikes tore through his aircraft. His canopy shattered. Control cables were severed. His engine bled oil. Any lighter fighter would have disintegrated. Somehow, the Thunderbolt stayed in the air. Johnson limped back to England in a machine that looked like it had been clawed apart by giants. The story became legend, but not the kind the American commanders wanted. Yes, the P-47 could absorb punishment, but it couldn't win. By mid-1943, the statistics were grim. The 56th Fighter Group, the first unit to fly the Thunderbolt in combat, had lost 11 aircraft in its first 4 months. 7 pilots were captured, 4 were dead. Bomber losses continued to climb. German fighters were reaching the formations before escorts could intervene. At 8th Air Force headquarters, patience was running out. Generals studied after-action reports and gun camera film. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. The Thunderbolt was the wrong aircraft for the job. It was too heavy, too short-ranged, too inflexible. Plans were already underway to replace it with a sleeker fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang, faster, lighter, longer-legged. A thoroughbred where the P-47 was a workhorse. 5 fighter groups were scheduled to transition to the Mustang by the end of 1943. The Thunderbolt program looked like a dead end. The Germans agreed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports described the P-47 as unsuitable for sustained fighter combat. German pilots were instructed not to fear it. Break away. Turn inside it. Force it slow. The Thunderbolt would lose. And in the skies of Europe that summer, it usually did. But inside the 56th Fighter Group was a man who saw the aircraft differently. Colonel Hubert Zemke was not a reckless ace or a romantic duelist. He was a student of aviation in its most unforgiving form. Before the war, Zemke had traveled through Europe as an observer, studying German tactics firsthand. He had watched Luftwaffe pilots in Spain, Poland, and France. He understood how they fought and why they won. Zemke did not deny the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. He embraced them. The P-47 cannot turn, he told his pilots bluntly. If you try to fight their fight, you will die. That statement alone put him at odds with decades of fighter doctrine. Since World War I, air combat had been about turning, maneuvering, outflying the opponent in a horizontal plane. The Thunderbolt broke those rules and punished anyone who forgot it. What Zemke saw, where others saw only failure, was unrealized potential. The P-47 could not turn, but it could dive. Its weight gave it momentum. Its thick wings held together at speeds that tore apart lighter aircraft. In a vertical dive, the Thunderbolt accelerated faster than anything the Luftwaffe flew. German pilots learned, sometimes too late, that once a P-47 went downhill, it did not let go. Zemke began to suspect that the problem was not the airplane. The problem was how it was being used. By late summer 1943, the Thunderbolt stood at a crossroads. To many, it was already obsolete. To the Germans, it was laughable. To American bomber crews, it was unreliable protection. But to Zemke, it was something else entirely. A weapon waiting for the right mathematics. The skies of Europe were about to find out which view was correct. By late summer of 1943, the war in the air over Europe had reached a breaking point. American bombers were flying deeper into Germany, and German fighters were waiting for them with ruthless efficiency. On some missions, more than one bomber out of every 5 failed to return. Entire crews vanished into smoke trails over occupied territory. The daylight bombing campaign, the cornerstone of American strategy, was bleeding itself to death. Inside the 8th Air Force, the Thunderbolt was on borrowed time. Yet at RAF Ellsworth, home of the 56th Fighter Group, Colonel Hubert Zemke was doing something few commanders dared. He was ignoring tradition. While other units trained for turning engagements and close-in dogfights, Zemke banned them outright. No mock dogfights, no horizontal maneuvering contest. Pilots who tried to mix it up the old way were grounded. Instead, Zemke turned fighter combat into arithmetic. He gathered his pilots in briefing rooms and talked not about heroics, but about energy, altitude, speed, mass, and gravity. He drew diagrams on chalkboards. He calculated climb rates and dive acceleration. He showed them what German pilots already understood instinctively. Air combat was physics before it was courage. At 30,000 feet, a P-47 held potential energy that no Luftwaffe fighter could ignore. 8,000 feet of altitude could be converted into more than 200 miles per hour of additional speed in a dive. That speed, multiplied by 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each firing nearly 800 rounds per minute, created a moment of overwhelming lethality. But only for seconds. Zemke's doctrine was brutally simple. One pass, no turning, no chasing. Dive, fire, break away, climb back to altitude. If the attack failed, accept it and try again later. Survival mattered more than ego. Many pilots struggled to unlearn what they had been taught. Fighter pilots were trained to pursue, to finish the fight, to stay engaged until the enemy was destroyed. Zemke told them the opposite. Disengagement was victory. Living to climb again was success. Throughout July and August 1943, the 56th Fighter Group trained relentlessly. Pilots practiced steep dives at angles exceeding 60 degrees. They learned to fire accurately at closing speeds over 400 miles per hour, speeds where a firing window lasted less than 2 seconds. They practiced recovery pulls that blacked them out momentarily under crushing G-forces. Some aircraft returned with wrinkled wings and stressed airframes. Ground crews patched them together. The Thunderbolt absorbed it all. Its thick wings, massive spars, and armored cockpit proved tougher than anyone had predicted. Zemke watched every detail. Fuel consumption, climb times, ammunition expenditure. He refined the system until it worked on paper, and then demanded it work in the air. By September, the 56th was ready. On the morning of October 4, 1943, the group received orders for a bomber escort mission deep into Germany. 52 P-47s were assigned to protect the formation of B-17s, striking industrial targets beyond the Dutch coast. Intelligence warned that the Luftwaffe was preparing a major interception. Radar tracked nearly 180 German fighters assembling along the route. In the past, this would have meant disaster. This time, Zemke changed everything. The bombers would fly at 22,000 feet. Zemke placed his Thunderbolts at 30,000, 8,000 feet above the formation. They were not escorting the bombers in the traditional sense. They were waiting. At 0952 hours, Zemke spotted the German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s, climbing into position ahead of the bomber stream. The Luftwaffe was executing its standard doctrine: gain altitude advantage, dive through the bombers, disengage before escorts could react. They never saw the Thunderbolts above them. Zemke rolled his aircraft inverted and pushed the nose down into a steep dive. 51 P-47s followed. 7 tons of aircraft accelerated toward the Earth, engines screaming, airspeed needles sweeping past 400 miles per hour. The sky compressed into a narrow tunnel of wind and vibration. The first German pilot died without knowing what hit him. Zemke's guns fired for less than a second. 8 streams of 50 caliber fire tore through the cockpit of a climbing F-190. The aircraft disintegrated and fell away in pieces. In the next 90 seconds, the German formation was ripped apart by diving Thunderbolts attacking from impossible angles at impossible speeds. German pilots tried to react. Some rolled into defensive turns, others attempted to dive away. Many pushed too hard, blacked out, or overstressed their aircraft. At least one FW-190 lost a wing in a high-speed dive, unable to withstand the forces the heavier P-47 absorbed. The Thunderbolts did not stay to fight. Each pilot made a single pass, then used his remaining speed to climb back toward altitude. 4 minutes later, they were ready to dive again. By 10:03 a.m., the sky above the bombers was empty. 21 German fighters were confirmed destroyed. 8 more were listed as probable. 16 were damaged. Not a single bomber was lost to fighter attack. Not one P-47 failed to return. At 8th Air Force headquarters, disbelief gave way to investigation. Pilots were interviewed separately. Gun camera footage was analyzed frame by frame. Radar tracks and radio intercepts were cross-checked. The numbers held. For the first time, the Thunderbolt had not merely survived. It had dominated. But October 4th was only one mission. One battle did not win a war. The Luftwaffe still had hundreds of fighters. German production continued. Bomber losses elsewhere remained severe. The question now was not whether Zemke's tactics worked. The question was whether they would work again. Within weeks, the answer would terrify the Luftwaffe and change the air war over Europe forever. October 1943 did not end on the 4th. What happened that morning over the Netherlands was not dismissed by the Luftwaffe as a fluke, but it was not immediately understood either. German intelligence officers reviewed reports that made little sense. Fighters destroyed without warning. Attacks from above formations that should have held altitude advantage. American pilots refusing to turn, refusing to chase, refusing to fight the way fighters were supposed to fight. At first, the Germans assumed coincidence, weather, poor visibility, pilot error. Then it happened again. On October 8th, the 56th Fighter Group escorted bombers to Bremen. Radar stations detected Luftwaffe units assembling in the familiar pattern, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s forming above the bomber stream, preparing their textbook dive attack. Zemke positioned his Thunderbolts high, invisible against the pale sky. The dive came without warning. 6 German fighters were destroyed in minutes. The bombers passed through unmolested. 0 American losses. 2 days later, October 10th, a massive raid drew more than 60 F-190s into the fight. This time, Zemke's pilots executed 3 successive diving attacks, one after another, each perfectly timed. 9 German fighters were confirmed destroyed. The bombers again completed their mission without losing a single aircraft to fighter attack. German squadron commanders began to notice a pattern. The Americans were no longer reacting, they were initiating. For 4 years, Luftwaffe doctrine had dominated European air combat. Gain altitude, control the vertical, strike with speed, disengage before the enemy could respond. It had crushed Polish fighters in days, broken the French Air Force in weeks, and bled the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. Now, the Americans were doing the same thing, only higher, faster, and with aircraft that refused to break apart. October 14th brought the reckoning everyone feared, the second Schweinfurt raid. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt were critical to German war production. Destroy them and aircraft engines, tanks and vehicles across the Reich would grind to a halt. The Luftwaffe committed everything it had. More than 300 fighters rose to meet 291 B-17s. The sky over Germany filled with contrails, cannon fire and burning aircraft. Zemke was not flying that day. He was at 8th Air Force headquarters, receiving the British Distinguished Flying Cross. Leadership of the 56th fell to his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling. Schilling followed Zemke's doctrine exactly. The Thunderbolts attacked from altitude, diving through German formations at maximum speed, breaking up coordinated assaults before they reached the bombers. 16 German fighters were confirmed destroyed by the group, more than any other escort unit that day. But the numbers no longer favored the Americans. Too many bombers, too few escorts. Even perfect tactics could not cover every formation. 68 B-17s were shot down. 680 American airmen were killed or captured in a single afternoon. The Schweinfurt raid became the darkest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. In the aftermath, senior commanders debated suspending deep penetration daylight raids entirely. Some argued that escort fighters, Thunderbolts included, could never solve the problem. The Mustang had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers. Losses were unsustainable. 4 days later, October 20th, the weather cleared over northern Germany. The 8th Air Force launched another maximum effort mission, this time against the Düren railway yards. Zemke was back in the cockpit. He positioned his group even higher, over 32,000 feet. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, including elements of Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 3, flown by some of Germany's most experienced pilots. Among them was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters. Wilhelm Galland was a veteran of Spain, France, and the Eastern Front. He had more than 50 confirmed victories. He knew every trick in the German playbook. He never saw the Thunderbolts coming. Zemke's group struck from above and behind at nearly 470 miles per hour. The engagement lasted less than 7 minutes. 17 German fighters were destroyed. Galland's FW-190 took multiple 50 caliber hits to the engine and cockpit and went into an unrecoverable spin from 23,000 feet. One of Germany's most experienced fighter leaders was gone. That loss sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. By the end of October, the numbers were undeniable. In 1 month, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed 39 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The group, that had been mocked for its inability to dogfight, had become the highest-scoring fighter unit in the 8th Air Force. German intelligence finally put a name to what they were facing. They called it the American diving tactic. Emergency conferences were held across occupied Europe. Jagdgeschwader commanders reported that P-47s were attacking from altitudes their fighters could not reach in time. Traditional interception patterns no longer worked. Attempts to force turning engagements failed because the Thunderbolts refused to commit. Major Günther Rahl, one of Germany's top aces, identified the problem with brutal clarity. The Americans were no longer escorting bombers. They were hunting fighters. Controllers tried to adapt. German formations were split into smaller elements. Some approached high, others low, others from the flanks. The goal was to divide American escorts and create an openings. Zemke countered with vertical layering. One squadron at 30,000 feet, one at 28,000, one at 26,000. No matter where German fighters appeared, a Thunderbolt always held the altitude advantage. Every engagement began on American terms. On November 5th, over Münster, Jagdgeschwader 1 attempted a coordinated multi-directional attack with 30 FW-190s. The 56 intercepted all three formations before they reached firing range. 14 German fighters were destroyed. The bombers lost none to fighter attack. Luftwaffe controllers began doing something unthinkable. They avoided the 56th Fighter Group. Radio intercepts revealed German pilots identifying Zemke's call signs and being redirected to other sectors. Better to miss an attack opportunity than lose experienced airmen to Thunderbolts falling from the sky. At 8th Air Force headquarters, commanders took notice. Other P-47 groups were competent, aggressive, well-trained, but none achieved the 56th's results. General Ira Eaker issued an order. Zemke would brief every Thunderbolt group in the 8th Air Force. On December 8, 1943, at Kingscliff Airfield, Zemke stood before dozens of group commanders and laid out his doctrine in stark terms. The P-47 could not turn. Accept it. Altitude was life. Speed was survival. Disengagement was victory. Some resisted. Decades of fighter tradition were hard to abandon. But the results were undeniable. The Thunderbolt had stopped being a liability. It had become a predator. And as winter approached, with clear skies over Germany and American production rising, the Luftwaffe faced a future it had never imagined, one where the sky itself was no longer on their side. By the beginning of 1944, the air war over Europe had changed, in ways few men fully understood at the time. The shift was not marked by a single announcement or a dramatic headline. It appeared instead in quieter numbers, declining bomber losses, growing German pilot shortages, and intelligence reports that spoke of fear rather than confidence. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as an error, was now at the center of that change. Winter weather temporarily slowed operations, but when the skies cleared, the 8th Air Force resumed its offensive with renewed intensity. The objective was no longer just to damage German industry, it was to break the Luftwaffe itself. In February 1944, the Allies launched what became known as Big Week, 6 consecutive days of massive daylight raids against German aircraft factories. The goal was simple and brutal: force the Luftwaffe into the air, then destroy it. Every available bomber and escort fighter was committed. It would become the largest air battle in history. For the 56th Fighter Group, Big Week presented a new challenge. Targets like Leipzig, Regensburg, and Augsburg lay far beyond the original escort range of the P-47. For months, critics had argued that no tactical brilliance could overcome the Thunderbolt's limited range. This time, the answer came not from doctrine, but engineering. Republic aviation engineers introduced modified external fuel tanks, 150 gallons each, mounted under the Thunderbolt's wings. Combined with internal fuel, the P-47 could now carry over 600 gallons. The price was weight. At takeoff, a fully fueled Thunderbolt weighed close to 9 tons. Climb performance suffered. If German fighters intercepted during that vulnerable phase, the consequences could be disastrous. Zemke calculated the solution with the same cold precision he applied to combat. The Thunderbolts would climb slowly over England, burning fuel from the external tanks first. The tanks would be dropped at a precise point over the Netherlands, far enough to reach deep targets, early enough to fight at combat weight. The margin for error was measured in minutes. On February 20th, 1944, the plan was tested. 54 P-47s of the 56th lifted off from RAF Halesworth and climbed to 30,000 feet over the North Sea. Over Holland, 108 empty fuel tanks fell away in unison. The Thunderbolts crossed into Germany light, fast, and ready. The Luftwaffe rose in force, nearly 190 fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader. The Germans had adapted. They no longer formed the large, easily spotted formations. Instead, they operated in small, dispersed units, attacking from multiple directions. The sky fractured into dozens of separate fights across more than 40 miles of airspace. The combat was chaotic, brutal, and relentless. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying alone over Brunswick, engaged 3 Bf-109s. He destroyed one, damaged another, and then dove to escape the third. Both aircraft exceeded 450 miles per hour. Johnson pulled out at low altitude. The German pilot blacked out under the G-forces and crashed. It was not luck. It was physics. Across the battle space, similar stories unfolded. German pilots attempted to turn with Thunderbolts and died. American pilots resisted the urge to chase and lived. The bombers reached Leipzig. 21 were lost to flak, but none to fighters. The escort had held. 5 days later, the unthinkable became routine. On March 6, 1944, American fighters escorted bombers all the way to Berlin. The German capital lay over 500 miles from the English coast. Every previous daylight raid on Berlin had suffered catastrophic losses once escorts turned back. This time, they did not. At 11:22 a.m., P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group crossed into Berlin airspace at 33,000 feet. 2 minutes later, Zemke spotted more than 70 German fighters assembling ahead of the bomber stream, FD-190s and Bf-109s. Everything the Luftwaffe could muster. Zemke led the dive personally. The Thunderbolt struck at nearly 460 miles per hour. 6 German fighters were destroyed in the opening seconds. The formation scattered. The fight devolved into a three-dimensional melee above the city itself. Tracers cut through the cold air. Wreckage fell toward the streets below. For the first time in the war, American fighters held air superiority over Berlin. Flak took its toll. 11 bombers were lost, but not a single bomber fell to German fighters during the bomb run. The Luftwaffe had been held at bay over its own capital. The mission's significance went beyond numbers. It shattered a psychological barrier. The Reich was no longer unreachable. The Luftwaffe was no longer dominant, even at home. For his leadership and tactical innovation, Zemke received the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation credited him not for bravery alone, but for transforming an aircraft once deemed inadequate into one of the most effective fighters of the war. 3 months later, that transformation proved decisive again. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the success of the Normandy invasion depended on total air supremacy. German fighters could not be allowed anywhere near the beaches. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned to ensure exactly that. They launched before dawn. Their first sweep found empty skies over the channel. The Luftwaffe had withdrawn inland, preparing counterattacks. The Thunderbolts went after them instead. Near Cannes, Zemke spotted Fu-190s scrambling from an airfield. The P-47s attacked during takeoff when German aircraft were heaviest and most vulnerable. 9 fighters were destroyed on the ground. 4 more were shot down attempting to climb. Not one German fighter reached the invasion beaches that morning. By sunset on D-Day, the 56th had flown 97 sorties, destroyed 23 enemy aircraft, and suffered no losses. The landing succeeded in part because German air power never arrived. Zemke left the group in August 1944 to rebuild another struggling unit. The 56 did not falter. Under Colonel David Schilling, it continued fighting through the Battle of the Bulge and into the heart of Germany. When the war ended, the numbers told the final story. The 56th Fighter Group flew 447 combat missions, nearly 20,000 sorties, more than 67,000 combat flight hours, 677 1-2 confirmed air-to-air victories, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. It was the only American fighter group in Europe to fly the same aircraft type from first combat mission to last. Pilots like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and David Schilling became the highest-scoring American aces of the European theater, not because they were reckless, but because they understood discipline, restraint, and mathematics. The aircraft German pilots once laughed at had outscored them all. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not win because it changed. It won because the men flying it learned how to think. They refused to fight the enemy's fight. They made the enemy fight theirs. And in the cold, thin air above Europe, physics decided the outcome.